Tobruk, Libya, June 1942. A British tank commander is bailing out of a burning Crusader. The turret hatch is open. He is moving fast, too fast. The hammer spur of his Enfield No.2 revolver catches on the hatch rim. He goes down. The tank is still burning. Whether this specific incident happened exactly this way is not recorded in any single document. What is recorded, across dozens of maintenance reports, unit complaints, and War Office memoranda from the late 1930s, is that tank crews throughout the Royal Armoured Corps were reporting the same problem consistently, urgently, and with the specificity of men whose lives depended on getting it right. The hammer spur on the Enfield No.2 Mk revolver was catching on hatches, on webbing, on every protrusion inside a tank that a panicking man could snag it on. The Royal Tank Regiment submitted their complaint formally. The War Office listened. And the solution they implemented in 1938 was the one that every experienced shooter who has held both versions of the revolver will tell you was the wrong answer to the right question. They removed the hammer spur entirely. They converted the weapon to double action only. They took away the ability to cock the revolver with the thumb, which every man trained in deliberate aimed fire had been taught was the correct technique for accurate shooting beyond 10 yards. They made the trigger pull heavier. They made the weapon less accurate. They called the result the Enfield No.2 Mk 1 and they issued it to the entire British Army, not just the tank crews who had asked for the change. Everyone. The story of why Britain's standard sidearm of the Second World War was deliberately made harder to shoot accurately is the story of how a single legitimate complaint by a specific group of soldiers became a universal solution imposed on soldiers who had never asked for it, and how the official reason concealed a more economical truth that nobody in the War Office wanted to say out loud. The Enfield No.2 began as a replacement for the Webley Mark VI. After 1918, the institutional consensus was that the Webley was too large, too heavy, and fired a cartridge requiring too much training for a conscript army. The War Office wanted a .38 caliber sidearm. Webley and Scott developed a scaled-down Mk4 revolver to meet the specification and submitted it for trials. The War Office commissioned the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield to produce something similar but just different enough to avoid paying Webley for it. Webley sued. The Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors settled the case for £1,250, roughly half of what Webley had spent developing the revolver. The Enfield No.2 was formally adopted in 1932. It was, by any honest assessment, the Webley Mk4 with minor internal modifications and a government stamp on the frame. The revolver that entered British service was the product of institutional larceny dressed up as independent development, and the weapon it replaced was waiting to reclaim its position the moment Enfield production could not keep pace with wartime demand, which it couldn't, resulting in the government ironically purchasing Webley Mark IVs anyway, as wartime demand outstripped Enfield capacity. The .38/200 cartridge that the No.2 fired was, on paper, a reasonable choice. The 200-grain lead bullet at roughly 620 feet per second generated stopping power through momentum rather than velocity. British ordnance officers insisted it had equivalent man-stopping performance to the old Webley cartridge. Combat veterans disagreed. When the Hague Convention's requirements replaced the lead bullet with a 178-grain full-metal jacket projectile at similar velocity, the terminal effect dropped noticeably. The men who noticed most acutely were tank crews, airborne officers, commandos, and SOE operatives, men for whom the sidearm was a weapon of last resort, rather than a ceremonial accessory. The official record contains few eloquent complaints about cartridge performance. It contains a great number of quietly recorded preferences for the American Colt Official Police, the Smith & Wesson Military and Police, and eventually the Browning High Power. The technical facts of the Mark 1 star conversion are straightforward. The hammer spur, the small projection at the top of the hammer that a shooter's thumb presses back to cock the weapon, was machined off. Without the spur, the hammer could not be pulled back manually. The revolver could only be fired by pulling the trigger through its full double-action arc, which simultaneously cocked and released the hammer. The trigger pull required to accomplish this was considerably heavier than the single-action pull of a cocked revolver, heavier by a factor of roughly 3 in most examples, and the movement of the trigger through that arc introduced a degree of muzzle disturbance that degraded accuracy at distances beyond 10 to 15 yards. For a tank crew who needed their sidearm only in extremis, at ranges of arm's length to a few yards, the Mach 1 Star made sense. The modification addressed their specific complaint, no spur to snag, without significantly affecting the combat utility of the weapon for the use case that tank crews actually faced. The problem was the extrapolation. The War Office, having solved the tank crew's problem, extended the solution to the entire army without a corresponding analysis of whether all other users of the Enfield faced the same problem. Officers in infantry formations who had been taught to shoot at bullseye targets in deliberate single-action fire suddenly found their weapons incapable of that technique. Veteran NCOs who had qualified on the Mach 1 and knew the difference between the two trigger pulls had their Mk1s converted to Mk1 Star configuration as they came in for maintenance. By the time large-scale production of the Mach 1 Star was underway, some armourers in individual units were quietly converting Mach 1 Stars back to approximate Mach 1 configuration by fitting modified hammers, not officially, not at scale, and with parts that were not always dimensionally matched, but with the clear conviction that the official solution was inadequate for their users' needs. Here is the part of the story that the official explanation never quite addresses. The Athlon Outdoors Assessment, drawing on the research of multiple firearms historians, states plainly that most historians nowadays believe the real reason for the Mk 1 Star was that it was cheaper and faster to manufacture. Removing the hammer spur eliminated a precision machining step. The simplified hammer required less skilled labor to produce. In a wartime economy where the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield was attempting to produce revolvers alongside rifles, submachine guns, and a dozen other weapons for an army that had left most of its small arms in France, production simplification was not a minor consideration. It was the difference between meeting the demand and falling catastrophically short of it. The tank crew's complaint provided the official justification for a manufacturing decision that had already been made, or was on the verge of being made, for economic reasons that the War Office was not going to describe in the paperwork. The Royal Tank Corps had a legitimate problem with the hammer spur. The War Office had a legitimate problem with production costs. The Mk 1 Star solved both simultaneously, while attributing the change entirely to the first and never mentioning the second. That is the story that the official record does not tell, and that the manufacturing evidence, simpler components, fewer machining steps, faster assembly, strongly implies. Tell a soldier his weapon was changed because a tank crew complained about a snag point. Do not tell him it was changed because it was cheaper. One of those explanations is acceptable. The other invites a different kind of question. If you have made it this far and are not subscribed, that changes now. One click. The Enfield No.2 Mk 1 Star was produced in numbers that reflect the scale of wartime demand. Approximately 380,000 Enfield No.2 revolvers of all marks were manufactured during the war years. The primary manufacturer beyond Enfield itself was Albion Motors of Scotstoun in Glasgow, which produced approximately 24,000 complete revolvers. The Singer Sewing Machine Company of Clydebank contributed critical components rather than complete weapons. The company that had made domestic sewing machines since the 1850s machined parts to ordnance specification and fed them into the assembly chain, which is its own remarkable image, precision components for a military revolver, coming off the same production lines that had been producing domestic appliances the year before. The manufacturing pressure also produced a third variant that the official record tends to underemphasize. The Mach 1 Star, the double-starred variant, introduced in 1942, stripped the design further still, removing the revolver safety entirely in the drive to accelerate output. Units that received the Mach 1 Star had a weapon that was faster to produce, simpler to maintain, and one step more minimalist than anything the original designers had intended. The production panic of 1942 had taken a weapon that had already been simplified once, for manufacturing reasons, disguised as tactical ones, and simplified it again. The government also purchased quantities of the Webley Mk. in .38/200, the revolver it had stolen the design of and failed to pay adequately for, because Enfield production was still insufficient. American Smith & Wesson and Colt revolvers in compatible calibers arrived under Lend-Lease. The Browning High Power, 13 rounds of 9mm, favored by the SOE and the airborne forces who needed more ammunition and more reliability than any revolver could offer, became the aspirational weapon of every officer who had fired both. The No.2 served anyway, because it was there, because it worked, and because in the hands of a soldier who understood its limitations and shot within them, it was reliable, fast to reload, and accurate enough for the distances at which handguns actually decide fights. The Enfield No.2 was declared obsolete at the end of the Second World War, but continued in British service until the Browning High Power fully replaced it in April 1969. 24 years of obsolescence, during which it was carried by police forces across the former empire, retained by reserve units, and quietly used by anyone for whom the high power was not yet available. Veterans who had qualified on the Mk. And carried the Mk. Star through the war held a consistent view that appears across oral history accounts with remarkable regularity. The Mk. Was the weapon they had wanted. The Mk. Star was the weapon they had been given. The tank crews had a legitimate complaint. The War Office had a legitimate cost problem. The infantry officer who wanted to shoot accurately at 20 yards had a legitimate need. The solution addressed the first, disguised the second, and ignored the third. A weapon that solved one problem created another, concealed the real reason for both, and served the British Army for 40 years anyway, because nothing better was available in the numbers that were needed, and because a weapon that works is a weapon that stays in service regardless of what the paperwork says about it.